Now, picture this. A darkness so absolute it feels heavy, pressing against the very glass of your windows with a weight you can almost measure. It is February 1899, on the wind-scoured edge of the Montana Territory, and the atmosphere has just turned into a predator. Outside, the mercury has retreated so far into the bulb of the thermometer that it has vanished entirely, bottoming out at a bone-shattering -55 degrees Fahrenheit. At this temperature, the world doesn't just get cold, it breaks. The very chemistry of survival shifts. If you were to step outside and exhale, your breath would not simply drift away as a mist, it would crackle. The moisture in your lungs would undergo a phase transition so violent that the exhaled vapor would turn into ice dust before it even cleared your lips, falling to the frozen ground with a microscopic tinkle. But you aren't outside. You are huddled within the walls of a modified barn, listening to the sounds of a structural execution. Suddenly, a sound like a .30-06 rifle shot rings out, vibrating through the floorboards and rattling the teeth in your skull. It isn't a predator with a gun. It is the sap inside a 10-inch pine support beam freezing and expanding with such localized hydraulic force that the wood fibers literally explode. This is the Sap-Freeze, a phenomenon that signals the beginning of the end for most frontier structures. When the beams start screaming, the house is losing its battle with the gray wolf of the atmosphere. Think about that for a second. While the world outside is turning into a lunar wasteland, most people in the Little Missouri River Basin are huddled in standard-issue homestead cabins, trusting their lives to 1-inch pine boards and a prayer. But in this specific barn, a mother and her 2 daughters are doing something different. They are moving with a calculated, rhythmic precision. They aren't panicking because they have already turned their home into a thermal fortress. The numbers don't lie, and the math of 1899 was written in frost and funeral shrouds. In the nearby settlements, families are already dying. They are doing everything the experts of the 19th century told them to do, and yet they are freezing to death in their beds with stacks of seasoned oak still sitting in their wood boxes. Why did they fail? While this woman, an eccentric who defied the architectural norms of her time, managed to keep her children in a state of shirt-sleeve comfort during the worst cold wave in American history? Here's what everyone missed. The cold isn't just a temperature. It is a sentient biological hunter. At -55 degrees, it actively searches for a way in. It looks for a single iron nail head, a tiny silver dot in the wall. That nail acts as a thermal bridge, a microscopic highway that allows the warmth of the room to be sucked into the void, while the cold crawls inward, frosting the metal until it looks like a white, fuzzy finger pointing at your chest. Most people saw a house as a shield. She saw it as a sieve that needed to be plugged. To understand the siege, we have to look at the landscape of 1899. This wasn't just a cold snap. It was the Great Cold Wave, a meteorological anomaly that saw temperatures drop 40 degrees in a matter of hours across the American Midwest. The frontier was littered with the remnants of the 1862 Homestead Act settlers who were required by law to build permanent dwellings to claim their land. But the law didn't understand thermodynamics. The standard homestead cabin was a death trap of 1-inch pine boards. Let that sink in. A single inch of wood provides an R value of roughly 1.25. To maintain a life-sustaining 65 degrees Fahrenheit inside, when the exterior is screaming at -55, you are asking that thin sliver of wood to hold back a temperature differential, a delta T of 120 degrees. It is physically impossible. The heat doesn't just leak out. It vanishes as if the walls aren't even there. But this mother, whose name has been whispered in local histories as a deviant architect, refused to build a standard cabin. She saw the standard as a blueprint for a coffin. Instead of a cabin, she built a box within a box. She utilized a barn, a massive, sprawling structure that most would find impossible to heat, and she engineered a core of survival within its center. She wasn't just building for the weather she expected, she was building for the predator she feared. As the sun dipped below the horizon on that fateful February evening, the atmospheric pressure began to climb, reaching a density that made the air feel thick and viscous. This is where the physics of the cold plug begins. In a normal house, hot air rises up the chimney, creating a vacuum that pulls fresh air in. But at -55, the air outside is so heavy, so unimaginably dense, that it acts like a physical lid. It sits on top of the chimney like a stone. In cabins across the territory, the smoke began to stall. The fires that were supposed to save the families started to chug, gasping for oxygen that couldn't reach them through the heavy atmospheric ceiling. The carbon monoxide, unable to escape, began to backfill into the small, tight rooms. This is the invisible assassin. It doesn't smell like smoke. It smells like nothing. It makes you feel sleepy, cozy, even warm. It gives your skin a deceptive, healthy-looking cherry-pink glow as it replaces the oxygen in your bloodstream. The neighbors who fell asleep peacefully weren't actually sleeping. They were being chemically suffocated by the very fires they built to stay alive. But in our modified barn, the mother had accounted for this. She had installed a deviant piece of engineering, a dedicated 3-inch external air intake pipe made of hammered tin, running directly from the subfloor to the firebox of her stove. Her fire didn't breathe the room's air. It didn't fight the cold plug. It drew its own life from the outside, creating a closed-loop system that kept the oxygen in the living quarters pure while the fire raged against the dark. This was the first layer of her defense, a mastery of convection that separated the life-giving warmth from the life-taking gases. But the air was only half the battle. The real enemy was the sponge effect. Most people think of insulation as something that keeps the cold out. She understood it was something that kept the vibration of heat in. She had watched her neighbors haul cord after cord of wood, burning through their entire winter supply in a single week, because they were trying to heat the entire atmosphere through their thin walls. They were trying to fill a bucket that had no bottom. She, however, had spent the preceding autumn collecting what the local farmers called trash. She had gathered hundreds of compressed straw bales, each one nearly 18 inches thick. She didn't just stack them, she integrated them into the very skeleton of her inner box. A straw bale, when compressed and kept dry, provides an R value of nearly 1.45 per inch. At 18 inches, she had created a thermal barrier with an R value of over 26. To put that into perspective, the cabins around her had a thermal resistance of roughly 1.5. She had created a wall that was nearly 20 times more efficient at holding onto energy. While her neighbors were frantically feeding their stoves every 20 minutes, she could bank her fire, close the dampers, and the temperature inside her inner sanctum wouldn't drop more than 5 degrees in 6 hours. She wasn't just a mother, she was a structural survivalist conducting a post-mortem on the very idea of the American frontier home. She saw that the iron nails everyone else used were becoming brittle. At these temperatures, the molecular structure of mid-19th century iron undergoes a transition. It becomes glass-like. If the wind hit a cabin hard enough, the nails wouldn't bend. They would shatter, a phenomenon known as brittle fracture. Knowing this, she had used wooden peg joinery for the critical load-bearing sections of her inner box. Wood doesn't become brittle in the cold. It actually becomes slightly stronger as the residual moisture freezes into a rigid crystalline lattice. Her home was flexible, organic, and thermodynamically quiet. As the first night of the Great Cold Wave reached its nadir, the wind began to howl, a biological scream that sounded less like moving air and more like a wounded animal. The wind chill factor, a concept not yet named, but certainly felt pushed the effective temperature down toward -80 degrees. This is the point where the gray wolf begins to gnaw at the corners of the world. In the settlements of Havre and Glasgow, the windows of the standard cabins began to fail, not because the wind blew them in, but because of thermal shock. The difference between the fire-heated interior glass and the -55 exterior glass created a tension so great that the panes simply disintegrated, turning into razor-sharp confetti. Once the glass was gone, the wolf was inside. Within 3 minutes of a window breaking, a room's temperature will drop from 60 degrees to 0. In 10 minutes, the human core begins to shut down. In our barn, however, there were no windows to the outside world. The mother had designed her living quarters as a box within a box. The outer barn acted as a massive buffer, a dead air zone that took the brunt of the wind and the initial temperature drop, By the time the cold reached the walls of her inner sanctum, it had lost its kinetic energy. It was a stagnant, frozen pressure rather than a piercing wind. She had even gone a step further, layering cured bison hides thick, oily, and impenetrable 3 inches away from the interior wood walls. This created a secondary dead air gap, a technique used by indigenous peoples for millennia, but ignored by the modern settlers of 1899. This gap acted as a final barrier, a place where the air was so still it became a solid wall of insulation. Now, picture the scene inside that inner room. While the rest of the territory is a frozen hellscape of screaming wind and shattering wood, the daughters are sitting on a rug made of sheepskin. They are reading by the light of a single oil lamp. The air is still. It is silent. The only sound is the low, rhythmic thrum of the Russian-style stove, a massive masonry heater she had built from riverstone and cob. This stove wasn't a thin cast-iron box that went from red-hot to stone-cold in an hour. It was a thermal battery. It weighed nearly 3,000 pounds. Once she had fired it up for 4 hours in the afternoon, the stones would hold that heat, radiating it slowly and evenly for the next 12 to 16 hours. She didn't need to stay up all night feeding the beast. She had already charged the room. But as the clock ticked toward 3 in the morning, the dead hour when the human metabolism is at its lowest and the cold is at its most aggressive, the mother stood up. She felt a change in the air, a slight metallic taste on the back of her tongue. The atmosphere was shifting again. The siege was about to enter its most dangerous phase. She knew that the numbers were against her. Even with her R-26 walls, even with her thermal mass, she was fighting a war of attrition. The cold was now trying to use her own breath against her. Every exhale from her and her daughters added moisture to the room. In a perfectly sealed box, that moisture would condense on the walls, soak into the straw, and destroy its R value, turning her fortress into a frozen sponge. She had to vent the room without losing the heat, a thermodynamic paradox that would have baffled the average homesteader. But she had a plan. She had engineered a decoy heat zone in the hallway between the inner box and the outer barn. She was moving now, her movements deliberate, her eyes fixed on the flicker of the lamp. She wasn't just a woman trying to survive a storm. She was an engineer managing a life support system in a vacuum. She understood that if she made one mistake, if she let the cold plug win, or if she let the invisible assassin into the room, or if she allowed the Sap-Freeze to compromise her inner supports, her daughters wouldn't just be cold. They would become part of the frozen history of 1899, another set of statistics in a year that the frontier would never forget. The neighbors hadn't run out of wood, they hadn't run out of courage, they had simply run out of physics. They had followed the rules of a world that only exists above 0 degrees. As the mother checked the seals on her bison hide curtains, she knew that the next 48 hours would be the ultimate test of her deviant design. The gray wolf was no longer just at the door. It was trying to breathe through the very pores of the wood. And the battle for the Little Missouri River Basin was only just beginning. The mother did not move with the frantic energy of the panicked. She moved with the rhythmic, terrifyingly calm precision of an architect who had already seen the collapse in her mind's eye, years before the first snowflake fell. To understand the survival of this family, you have to understand the deviant nature of their fortress. She hadn't just built a room. She had engineered a thermal lung, a living organ of stone and straw that could breathe in a vacuum of cold. Think about that for a second. While the rest of the Montana Territory was building upward, reaching toward the sky with thin, proud pine boards that acted as nothing more than cooling fins for the wind, she had gone downward and inward. She understood a fundamental law of the frontier that the surveyors and the government homesteading agents had completely ignored. The earth is a battery. Even when the air is screaming at -55 degrees, the soil, if you go deep enough, remains a constant, stubborn 45 or 50 degrees. She had begun the construction 2 years prior, not by framing walls, but by excavating. She dug a pit 10 feet deep and 20 feet wide into the heart of the barn's footprint. This was her heat sump. In the logic of 1899, this was seen as madness. Why live in a hole like a badger when you could have a proper house with a porch. But she knew that every inch of soil was a layer of insulation that the wind could never strip away. She lined this pit with flat river stones heavy, dense basalt and granite. She had hauled from the banks of the Little Missouri, one wagon load at a time. Now, picture the layering of this floor. It wasn't just dirt. She had created a thermal sandwich. First, a foot of packed gravel for drainage. Then a layer of charcoal to prevent moisture from wicking upward because moisture is the conductor of death in a cold wave. And finally, 2 feet of hand-tamped cob, a mixture of clay, sand, and straw. This floor was designed to hold onto the heat like a sponge holds water. When the fire in the center of the room burned, it wasn't just heating the air, it was charging the ground. But it was the walls of the inner sanctum where the true deviant engineering took place. She didn't use standard framing. She used a technique that wouldn't become a recognized architectural standard for nearly another century: compressed straw-bale construction. In the late 1800s, straw was considered waste, something to be bedding for the livestock or burnt in the fields. She saw it differently. She saw the hollow tubes of the straw as millions of tiny, dead air chambers. She used a mechanical hay press to create bales that were nearly 2 feet thick and dense enough that a knife couldn't be driven into them. She stacked these bales in a running bond, like giant yellow bricks, inside the wooden skeleton of the barn. But here is the critical detail that everyone else missed. She didn't let the straw touch the wooden exterior walls of the barn. She left a 4-inch gap, a dead air buffer, between the outer pine siding and the inner straw wall. This gap served a dual purpose. First, it prevented the cold bridge. If the outer wood became wet or frosted, that cold couldn't conduct directly into the straw. Second, it allowed for the chimney effect in reverse. The cold air trapped in that 4-inch gap acted as a secondary insulator, a layer of stagnant atmosphere that the wind couldn't penetrate. The numbers don't lie. If you calculate the thermal resistance of 2 feet of high-density straw bales, combined with a 4-inch air gap and a 1-inch pine shell, you arrive at an R value of roughly 35. In 1899, the average home had an R value of less than 2. She was living in a space that was 17 times more efficient than the local sheriff's office. She wasn't fighting the cold. She had effectively removed herself from its jurisdiction. But straw is organic, and in the damp of a Montana spring or the frost heave of a winter, it can rot. To prevent this, she coated the interior of the straw walls with 3 layers of lime plaster. She didn't just slap it on. She worked it into the fibers of the straw with her bare hands, creating a breathable skin. This lime plaster did something miraculous. It regulated the humidity. At minus 55 degrees, the air becomes so dry it can literally suck the moisture out of your eyeballs and throat. But the lime and straw walls held a reservoir of moisture, releasing it slowly to keep the air inside the inner box at a constant, comfortable 40% humidity. Let that sink in. While her neighbors were waking up with their eyelids frozen shut and their skin cracking from the desert dry cold of the storm, her daughters were breathing air that felt like a spring morning. Then there was the heart of the machine, the Russian stove. In the 19th century, most Americans used cast-iron potbelly stoves. These were the height of modern technology, but they were thermodynamic disasters. They got incredibly hot, radiating intense infrared heat that scorched your skin while leaving your back freezing, and the moment the fire went out, the iron cooled in minutes. The mother rejected this. She built a masonry heater that occupied nearly 1/4 of the inner room's floor space. It was a labyrinth of smoke. Instead of the smoke and heat going straight up a chimney and out into the night, she engineered a serpentine flue system inside the stone. The hot gases from the fire had to travel 30 feet of horizontal and vertical stone channels before they were allowed to exit. As the smoke traveled, it gave up every ounce of its heat to the 3,000 pounds of river stone and clay. By the time the exhaust reached the outside air, it was barely warm to the touch. She wasn't wasting a single British thermal unit. The stove was a massive, silent battery. She would burn one intense, roaring fire for 2 hours in the evening, using less wood than a neighbor would use in an hour, and that 3,000 pounds of stone would slowly release that heat for the next 20 hours. The engineering went even deeper. down to the very way the structure was held together. Iron was the pride of the industrial age, but she knew that iron was a traitor in the extreme cold. At -55 degrees, the impurities in 19th century iron, the phosphorus and the sulfur, made the metal undergo a phase change. It became as brittle as a teacup. If a heavy gust of wind hit the barn, the iron nails wouldn't just pull out, they would snap. She replaced the iron. Every major joint in the inner survival box was held together by tree nails, 1-inch diameter pegs of seasoned white oak. She had hand-tapered each one, and keyline dried them until they were bone dry. When she drove them into the green timber of the frame, the pegs absorbed the ambient moisture and swelled, locking the joints with a force that no iron bolt could match. And unlike iron, the wood didn't become brittle. It remained flexible, a living lattice that could groan and bend under the weight of the snow and the hammer blows of the wind without ever shattering. Now, picture this. It is 4 in the morning. The wind is moving at 60 miles per hour, carrying with it a ground blizzard of ice crystals so fine they can penetrate the weave of a wool coat. The atmospheric pressure is so high, it feels like a weight on your chest. Outside, the world is a chaotic, screaming void of blue and white. But inside the deviant box, the mother is performing the final act of her nightly engineering audit. She moves to the bison hide curtains. These weren't just decorative rugs. She had treated them with a mixture of bear grease and beeswax, making them completely air impermeable. She had hung them 3 inches away from the lime-plastered walls on wooden rods. This created yet another dead air gap. It was a triple-layer defense. The outer barn, the air gap, the straw bale, the lime plaster, and finally, the bison hide. Each layer was a thermal break, a place where the vibration of heat was forced to stop and rest. She was managing the delta T, the temperature difference in stages. Across the territory, people were trying to jump from -55 to 60 degrees in a single step 1 inch of pine. They were losing. The physics was crushing them, but she was stepping the temperature down in increments. The outer barn was perhaps 0 degrees. The air gap was 15. The straw bale moved it to 40. The masonry heater brought the inner air to a steady 65. By the time the cold of the Montana night reached her daughter's skin, it wasn't a predator anymore. It was a defeated, exhausted remnant of a storm. Here's what everyone missed. She had even accounted for the calorie ledger. She knew that her daughter's bodies were themselves small heaters, each producing about 100 watts of energy. In a large, drafty house, that heat is lost instantly. But in a small, perfectly insulated box, those 200 watts of biological heat were a significant part of the thermal equation. She had designed the room's volume to surface area ratio specifically to harness the heat of their own heartbeats. She sat down on the edge of the hearth, her hand resting on the warm stone. The stove was singing a low, resonant hum that told her the draft was perfect. The external air intake she had fashioned from hammered tin was working. She could hear the faint whistle of the outside air being pulled directly into the firebox, bypassing the room entirely. This meant she didn't have to worry about the invisible assassin, the carbon monoxide that was, at that very moment, beginning to fill the lungs of the families in the valley who had sealed their doors and windows without an intake vent. She looked at her daughters. They were sleeping so deeply their breath was barely audible. This was the ultimate proof of her deviant design. In a standard cabin, you never slept deeply in a cold wave. You tossed and turned as the side of your body facing the fire roasted while your back turned to ice. You woke up every 30 minutes to shove more wood into a ravenous, inefficient stove. But here, in the heart of the box within a box, the temperature didn't fluctuate by more than 3 degrees all night. The mother was a forensic architect of the future, living in the past. She had looked at the standard way of life and saw it for what it was, a collective agreement to ignore the laws of physics. She had chosen to be a deviant because she realized that in the face of a 100-year storm, normal was just another word for dead. As the sun began to rise, not as a bright orb, but as a dim, frozen gray smear in the east, the mother knew they had survived the first night. But the Great Cold Wave of 1899 wasn't a one-night event. It was a siege that would last for weeks. The gray wolf was still outside. and it was growing hungrier. The frost on the outer barn's timber was now 3 inches thick, the weight of it causing the massive beams to groan. The Sap-Freeze was continuing its execution of the surrounding forest, with the sounds of exploding trees echoing like a distant battlefield. But inside the straw and the stone, the mother began to prepare breakfast. She didn't use a frying pan that would release too much moisture into the air. Instead, she placed a heavy clay pot inside the bread oven built into the side of the masonry heater. Everything was calculated. Every gram of wood, every drop of water, every breath. She was the master of a closed-loop system, a tiny pocket of civilization that the environment couldn't touch. She had turned the barn, a place for animals, into the most sophisticated laboratory of survival on the American continent. But then, she heard it. A sound that shouldn't be there. Not the wind, not the cracking of wood, but a rhythmic thud against the outer barn door. Something was trying to get in, and it wasn't the wind. She stood up, her hand reaching for the heavy iron poker by the stove. The siege was about to change. The physics of the storm were one thing, but the desperation of the standard world was another. The numbers don't lie, and the math of survival was about to get a lot more complicated, as the deviant fortress was no longer a secret. The external world, freezing and dying, had finally noticed the one chimney in the little Missouri River basin that was still breathing steady, silver smoke into the -55-degree air. The predator at the perimeter wasn't just the cold anymore. It was the envy of those who hadn't listened to the math. And the mother knew that the next stage of the battle wouldn't be fought with R values and thermal mass, but with the sheer, unrelenting will of a protector who had built a world that the rest of the world wanted to take. She walked toward the inner door, her boots silent on the warm cob floor. She didn't fear the cold, she had solved that equation. But as the thudding on the outer door grew louder, she realized that the gray wolf had many forms, and some of them walked on 2 legs. The engineering of the fortress was complete, but the test of its sanctuary was only just beginning. Every nail, every peg, and every bale of straw was about to be pushed to its absolute limit as the 80-hour mark approached. The thermal battery of the Russian stove was holding, but for how long could it sustain more than the 3 lives it was designed for? This was the calorie ledger rewritten in blood, the moment where the mother had to decide if her deviant design was a fortress for her family or a life raft for a dying territory. She gripped the handle of the inner door, feeling the slight vibration of the storm outside. The pressure differential was so great that the door felt heavy, as if the vacuum of the cold was trying to suck her out into the white. She took a breath of the warm, lime-scented air, the air she had engineered and prepared to face the reality of 1899. The siege had truly begun. The air inside the inner chamber felt different now. It was thicker, weighted with the presence of 3 living bodies and the slow, rhythmic breathing of a masonry heart. But while the mother felt safe within her straw-lined fortress, she was keenly aware of the invisible assassin that was, at this very moment, claiming the lives of families in every direction for 100 miles. To understand the danger, you have to understand the physics of a chimney stall, a phenomenon that turns a hearth from a savior into a silent executioner. Here's what everyone missed. In the standard cabins of 1899, the settlers were fighting a losing battle against the very air they were breathing. When the temperature drops to -55 degrees, the atmosphere undergoes a radical transformation. It becomes incredibly dense, settling over the landscape like an invisible ocean of lead. This heavy, frigid air creates what engineers call a cold plug. Think of it as a physical cap, a heavy lid made of frozen gas, sitting directly on top of every chimney in the territory. In a normal winter, the hot air from a fire is much lighter than the surrounding air, allowing it to rise easily through the flue and carry away the toxic byproducts of combustion. But at -55, the pressure differential shifts. The air outside is so heavy and the atmospheric pressure is so high that the smoke from a standard stove cannot push its way out. The fire begins to chug, gasping for air as the cold plug forces the smoke and gases back down the chimney and into the living room. Among these gases is the most dangerous predator of all, carbon monoxide. It is a colorless, odorless, and tasteless molecule that is more attractive to human hemoglobin than oxygen is. When you breathe it in, it doesn't cause you to cough or choke. Instead, it hitches a ride on your red blood cells, locking out the oxygen you need to survive. Let that sink in. The very families who thought they were sleeping soundly were actually drifting into a chemical coma. The most deceptive part is the physiological reaction. Carbon monoxide causes the capillaries to dilate, sending a rush of blood to the surface of the skin. This creates a cherry-pink flush in the cheeks, a morbid mimicry of health. In those frozen cabins, rescuers would later find entire families who looked like they were merely napping, their faces rosy and peaceful, when in reality, their blood had been turned into a toxic sludge that could no longer carry life. But the mother in our modified barn had anticipated the invisible assassin. She knew that a fire is a living thing that needs to breathe, and if it has to fight the room's occupants for oxygen, the occupants will always lose. This is why she had installed her deviant 3-inch external air intake pipe. Now, picture this: a hand-hammered tin tube, wrapped in layers of wool and sealed with pitch, running from the firebox of her masonry stove, down through the cob floor, and out into the subfloor of the barn. This pipe allowed the fire to draw fresh, oxygen-rich air directly from the outside. Her stove was a closed-loop system. It didn't consume the air in the room. It lived on its own supply. This engineering choice did more than just prevent carbon monoxide backflow. It solved the problem of the vacuum chill. In a standard cabin, every cubic foot of air that goes up the chimney must be replaced by air leaking in through cracks in the walls or under the door. By giving her stove a dedicated lung, the mother ensured that the warm, humid air she had painstakingly curated inside her inner box stayed exactly where it was. The numbers don't lie. By decoupling the fire's respiration from the room's atmosphere, she reduced her heating requirements by nearly 40%. She wasn't just staying warm, she was managing her oxygen levels with the precision of a modern submariner. She could sit in that room, watching the lamp flame burn steady and blue, a sign of high oxygen, while outside, the very air was becoming a weapon. As the clock struck midnight, signaling the start of the second full day of the Great Cold Wave, the gray wolf of the atmosphere decided to stop searching for a way in and started trying to tear the fortress down. The record blizzard hit with a ferocity that defied description. This wasn't just snow. It was ice dust traveling at 70 miles per hour, acting like an abrasive sandblaster against the wooden skin of the barn. This was the beginning of the 72-hour siege, the ultimate climax of her deviant design. The first test came at the 12-hour mark. In the distance, she could hear the thermal shock beginning to claim the last of the neighborhood's standing glass. When the temperature on one side of a window pane is 60 degrees and the other is -55, the molecular tension becomes unbearable. Suddenly, a sound like a crystal chandelier hitting a marble floor erupted from the outer barn. The single window she had left in the barn's hayloft had shattered, not from the wind, but because the glass had literally pulled itself apart at a molecular level. Within seconds, the wind-driven ice was screaming into the upper reaches of the barn. But this is where the box-within-a-box strategy proved its worth. The mother didn't panic. She had expected the outer shell to fail. She had designed the inner box to be a sanctuary of last resort. As the outer barn's temperature plummeted toward the ambient -55, the 4-inch air gap between the outer wall and her straw-bale core became a critical insulation zone. Think about that for a second. She had created a decoy heat zone. She allowed the outer barn to freeze entirely, essentially turning it into a giant, hollow windbreak. The wind could howl through the barn's rafters, and the ice could pile up against the inner straw walls, but the kinetic energy of the storm was broken. The inner box was no longer facing a 70-mile-per-hour wind. It was merely sitting in a very cold, very still pocket of air. By the 24-hour mark, the siege had moved from the structural to the biological. The calorie ledger was now the primary concern. In extreme cold, the human body is essentially a furnace that runs on fat and protein. To maintain a core temperature of 98.6 degrees against an exterior of -55, the metabolism must go into overdrive. The mother began the feeding protocol. She didn't feed her daughters bread or light soup. She fed them pemmican, a high-density mixture of dried bison meat, rendered fat, and crushed berries. This was high-octane fuel for the human engine. She knew that each of her daughters was producing roughly 100 watts of heat. In her perfectly insulated small-volume room, those 300 watts of body heaters were actually contributing to the thermal equilibrium. She was calculating the math in her head. 300 watts of biological heat, plus the slow, steady radiation from the 3,000 pounds of stone in the Russian stove, minus the negligible heat loss through the R35 straw walls. The equation was balancing. The room stayed at a constant 62 degrees. But at the 48-hour mark, the storm reached its terrifying nadir. The barometric pressure dropped so low that the oil in the lamp began to flicker and sputter, struggling to burn in the thin, pressurized air. This was the moment the gray wolf tried its most desperate tactic, the convection search. Cold air is heavier than warm air, and it will always seek the lowest point. It began to crawl under the outer barn doors, searching for any microscopic breach in the inner box's seal. It found a tiny gap where the tin intake pipe passed through the cob floor. Within minutes, a finger of white frost began to grow across the floor, a literal ice snake slithering toward the girl's feet. The mother didn't just plug the hole with a rag. She knew that a wet rag would freeze, expand, and make the hole larger. Instead, she used a mixture of wood ash and rendered tallow a primitive but effective thermal grout. She packed the gap with the oily paste, which remained flexible even in the extreme cold, cutting off the convection search before it could steal the room's warmth. Now, picture the scene as the blizzard reached its crescendo. The wind was so loud it was no longer a sound. It was a physical vibration that you could feel in your marrow. The entire barn, a massive structure of oak and pine, was groaning like a ship in a typhoon. The Sap-Freeze shots were now constant, a staccato rhythm of wood fibers exploding as the last of the moisture in the barn's skeleton turned to ice. In the center of this chaos, the inner room was a silent, warm bubble. The mother sat by the stove, her hand on the stone. She could feel the chugging of the fire, a rhythmic vibration, as the firebox battled the atmospheric pressure at the end of the intake pipe. It was a mechanical struggle, the fire gasping for life, fighting the cold plug that was trying to smother it from the outside. She reached for the dampers, adjusting the air-to-fuel ratio, with the delicacy of a watchmaker. She needed the fire to be hot enough to maintain the draft, but slow enough to preserve her wood supply. This was the thermal mass balance. If she burned the wood too fast, the stones would overheat and crack. If she burned it too slow, the cold plug would win and the invisible assassin would return. Hour 50. Hour 60. The girls were no longer reading. They were huddled together, not out of cold, but out of a primal fear of the noise outside. The wind was carrying scourge bits of frozen earth and gravel that rattled against the barn like buckshot. The mother stayed awake, a sentinel of physics, her eyes moving from the lamp flame to the ice snake on the floor to the stone hearth. She was managing a closed system in a universe that had turned into a void. Think about that for a second. She had created a space where the laws of the 1899 frontier no longer applied. She wasn't a victim of the weather. She was the governor of her own climate. The most dangerous moment came at the 64th hour. The cold plug outside had become so dense that the fire in the stove suddenly died. Not because it ran out of wood, but because the column of heavy air in the chimney had finally collapsed downward, snuffing the flames in a single, silent puff of gray ash. For the first time, the invisible assassin was in the room. The stove began to backvent a thin, acrid stream of smoke. The mother didn't hesitate. She didn't try to relight the fire, the pressure was too high. Instead, she slammed the iron dampers shut, sealing the stove entirely. This was the moment of truth for the Russian stove principle. She had charged the 3,000 pounds of stone for the last 60 hours. Even with the fire out, that stone was a battery of heat. She calculated that she had at least 14 hours of safety before the room's temperature would drop below 50 degrees. She moved her daughters away from the stove and toward the center of the room, wrapping them in the bison hides. She was now relying entirely on the dead air and the thermal mass. The storm was at its peak, the barn was screaming, the fire was dead, and the invisible assassin was lurking in the flue. But the room stayed warm. The straw bales held. The lime plaster breathed. The wooden pegs in the frame held the joints tight against the 70-mile-per-hour gusts. She sat in the dark, listening to the girl's steady breathing, her heart counting the seconds. She had solved for X. She had predicted the collapse of the draft, and she had built a battery large enough to outlast the cold plug. As the 70-second hour approached, the wind suddenly shifted. The pitch of the scream changed from a roar to a whistle. The barometric pressure began to rise. The gray wolf was moving on, leaving behind a world that had been fundamentally altered. The mother waited. She didn't open the door. She knew the cold trap was still waiting outside. She waited until she saw the first sliver of gray light through the cracks in the inner door, a sign that the ice dust was settling. She reached out and touched the masonry heater. It was still warm, not hot, but warm like the flank of a living animal. She had survived the climax. Her deviant engineering had stood against a pressure that had shattered glass, exploded wood, and suffocated the standard world. But as she prepared to open the door and face the aftermath, she knew that the statistics of the 1899 Great Cold Wave were about to be written in the snow. And she knew that the most harrowing part of the story wasn't the storm she had just defeated, but the frozen silence of the valley that was waiting for her outside. When the mother finally unlatched the heavy wooden bolt of the inner sanctuary, she wasn't greeted by the sound of birds or the softening of winter. She was greeted by a silence so profound it felt as though the world had been emptied of its soul. It was 72 hours since the mercury had vanished into the bulb, and as she stepped through the outer barn, she carried a handheld brass thermometer, a relic of her father's engineering days. She held it out into the air of the main barn floor, away from the radiant heat of her fortress. The needle didn't just drop, it plummeted. The air inside the barn, shielded from the wind but not the temperature, registered a staggering -59 degrees Fahrenheit. This was the moment of the forensic audit, the moment where the data of her deviant design would be measured against the harsh reality of the frontier. She walked toward the large barn doors, which were now fused shut by a wall of wind-packed sastrugi ice ridges as hard as concrete. She had to use a pickaxe to clear the threshold, and when the door finally groaned open, the visual shock was nearly physical. The landscape of the Little Missouri River Basin had been erased. There were no bushes, no fences, no outlines of the creek, only a monochromatic wasteland of white and bruised purple shadows. But it wasn't the sight that chilled her to the marrow. It was the physics of the aftermath. She began the 3-mile trek toward the nearest neighbor's homestead, the Miller cabin. She wasn't walking on snow. She was walking on a crystalline pavement of ice dust that didn't crunch. It shrieked under her boots. As she approached the Miller place, she didn't see the usual plume of friendly wood smoke. The chimney stood cold and jagged, like a broken tooth. The numbers don't lie. And the forensic audit of the Miller cabin was a blueprint of a disaster that had been written months in advance. The cabin was a standard homestead build, 1-inch pine boards, beautiful to look at in the autumn, but a thermodynamic death sentence in 1899. As she neared the walls, she saw what she had predicted, the silver finger of the atmospheric predator. Every single iron nailhead in the exterior siding was coated in a bulbous white growth of frost. These were the thermal bridges. Because iron has a thermal conductivity nearly 400 times higher than wood, each nail had acted as a microscopic vacuum, sucking the warmth from the interior and inviting the -59-degree cold to crawl straight into the center of the walls. But it was the structural integrity that revealed the most terrifying data point. She noticed that the corner of the Miller porch had collapsed, not from the weight of the snow, but from brittle fracture. She knelt and picked up a shattered iron bolt that had held the main support beam. It hadn't bent. It had snapped cleanly, with a crystalline grain visible in the cross-section. At these extreme temperatures, the iron had reached its ductile to brittle transition temperature. It had ceased to be a metal and had become a ceramic. It had shattered like glass under the simple contraction of the cooling wood. The Millers hadn't been defeated by a storm. They had been defeated by the molecular limits of their materials. Inside the cabin, the scene was a perfectly preserved icebox. This is where the math of the delta T became visceral. Because the R value of their walls was only 1.25, the heat they had generated from their potbelly stove had leaked out into the Montana sky almost as fast as they could produce it. To maintain 60 degrees inside against the -59 outside, that small stove would have needed to produce over 5,000 watts of continuous energy, the equivalent of running 3 modern electric ovens at full blast, 24 hours a day. They had run out of seasoned oak by the 48-hour mark. And once the fire died, the physics of the cold plug had taken over. Without the upward pressure of the heat, the heavy, dense atmosphere had slumped down the chimney, filling the room with a stagnant, frozen fog. The mother looked at the thermometer she had brought with her. Inside the miller's bedroom, the temperature was -45 degrees. Let that sink in. The interior of a permanent home was only 14 degrees warmer than the lethal void outside. The families who followed the rules of the 1900s, who built what the government and the catalogs told them to build, had been betrayed by a collective ignorance of thermodynamics. They had built for a climate that was an average, and nature had punished them with an outlier. The mother turned away, her own body still warm from the high-calorie pemmican and the residual heat stored in her bison skin coat. Her forensic audit was complete. Her deviant design hadn't just been a better way to live, it was the only way to survive a world that had no mercy for the standard. She had used stone, straw, and wooden pegs to solve an equation that iron and pine simply couldn't handle. As she walked back toward her barn, her fortress of straw and stone, she looked at the horizon. The great cold wave was receding, but the philosophy of her survival was only just beginning to take root in her mind. Nature wasn't cruel. It was just a series of cold, hard equations. If you didn't solve for X, the environment would solve it for you, and the answer was always 0. Think about that for a second. We live in a world of averages. We build our lives, our homes, and our systems to handle the expected. We trust the standards that have been handed down to us by architects and experts who have never felt the Sap-Freeze or heard the scream of a structural beam exploding at 50 below. We rely on a thin skin of normalcy to protect us from a universe that is, by its very nature, extreme. The mother in the Little Missouri River Basin understood something that we often forget. The predator is always at the perimeter. Whether that predator is a once-in-a-century weather event, a systemic collapse, or a simple failure of the materials we trust, it is always searching for a nailhead to bridge the gap. It is always looking for a sieve to pour itself through. Her legacy isn't just a story of a woman who survived a blizzard. It is a philosophy of the deviant mindset. It is the realization that when the environment turns hostile, the standard is the most dangerous thing you can own. Resilience isn't about having more fuel. It's about having a better R value. It's about building a box within a box in every aspect of your life, creating buffers of redundancy and thermal mass that can hold the vibration of your life when the outside world goes cold and silent. The numbers don't lie. The math of survival is consistent across centuries. Whether it is 1899 or the present day, the physics of the cold plug and the invisible assassin remain the same. We are all living in structures that are being tested by forces we don't always see. The question is, are you building for the weather you expect, or are you building for the predator you fear? Now, picture this. You are standing in your own home, listening to the wind. You look at your walls and your windows. Do you know where your thermal bridges are? Do you know if your standard would hold if the mercury vanished? This story is a reminder that survival is an active engineering project, not a passive state of being. As we close this forensic look into the great cold wave, let it be a call to look at the trash in your own life, the straw bales and river stones of your own resilience, and start building your own deviant fortress. Because the gray wolf of the atmosphere doesn't care about your titles or your plans, it only cares about the gap you left unplugged. Please remember, this narrative is for historical and educational purposes. Modern home heating, wood stove installation, and carbon monoxide safety are strictly regulated for a reason. If you are inspired to build your own thermal fortress, always consult with certified structural engineers and HVAC professionals, and never operate a combustion heater without a functioning, modern carbon monoxide detector. Don't let the invisible assassin be the one to teach you about physics. Build smart, build deviant, and most importantly, build to last. If this deep dive into the engineering of the frontier has changed the way you look at the walls around you, then the mother's legacy has done its job. Stay warm, stay curious, and keep solving for X.